something strange is happening in Cleveland, and almost no one is talking about it the way they should. Because just days ago, reports started surfacing that Dillon Gabriel, a top 100 draft pick, a player once hyped as a potential future leader, hasn't been involved in any real preparation for the 2026 season. No meaningful reps, no visible role, nothing. And when a quarterback just quietly disappears like that, it's never random. At first, people brushed it off. Maybe it's a minor setback. Maybe it's just a coaching decision. But the deeper you look, the more this situation starts to feel like something completely different, something behind the scenes, something the team doesn't want to say out loud. Because this isn't just about performance. This is about a fallout. And at the center of it is ShedeurSanders. Now here, where things start to get uncomfortable. Dillon Gabriel didn't arrive in Cleveland as just another backup. He came in with real hype. Analysts were already throwing around phrases like underrated steal and system fit. There was genuine belief that he could carve out a serious role in the offense, maybe even push for more. But almost immediately, something felt off. Not just on the field, but in the way he carried himself. Subtle comments, questionable moments, things that didn't sit right with fans and reportedly not with everyone inside the locker room either. And then the tension started to build. Because while Gabriel was trying to find his place, someone else was already taking control of the team. Not slowly, not quietly, but in a way that made it clear this wasn't going to be a shared spotlight. Shedeur wasn't just playing well. He was taking over. And that's when the narrative began to shift. If you love real talk and fearless NFL breakdowns, hit subscribe and join Coach Speaks. Because suddenly, it wasn't about two quarterbacks developing side by side anymore. It became something else entirely, a contrast, a comparison, and depending on who you ask, maybe even a conflict. Now, to be clear, not everything you're hearing is confirmed. There's a lot of speculation, a lot of talk, and a lot of noise coming from different directions. But when you line up the timing, the comments, and what's happening right now, it starts to paint a very specific picture. A picture where one player is rising fast, and another is being quietly pushed out of the frame. So the real question is, what actually happened behind closed doors? Because if the reports are even partially true, this isn't just a roster decision. This is a message. And what happened next might completely change how people see this team moving forward. The first real sign that something was off didn't come from a big announcement. There was no press conference, no injury report, no official statement that made headlines. It came quietly, almost too quietly. A report from Mary Kay Cabot began circulating, suggesting that Dillon Gabriel hadn't been actively involved in preparations for the 2026 season. Not just limited reps, not just easing back in. Completely absent from meaningful participation. And that's where things immediately raised eyebrows. Because we're not talking about a fringe player fighting for a roster spot. This was a top 100 draft pick, a quarterback who, not long ago, had real expectations attached to his name. Players like that don't just fade into the background without a reason. At first, some fans tried to rationalize it. Maybe it's part of a long-term development plan. Maybe the coaching staff is experimenting with rotations. Maybe there's something internal the public doesn't know yet. All fair possibilities on the surface. But then more details started to trickle in. No footage from practice. No mentions during team updates. No visible involvement during key off-season activities. Even in moments where quarterbacks are typically rotated in just to get a look, Gabriel's name wasn't coming up. And that silence, it started to feel louder than any statement. Because in the NFL, especially with a team like the Cleveland Browns, everything is tracked. Every rep, every snap, every development is usually documented in some way. So when a player suddenly becomes invisible, it's not accidental. It's intentional. And that's when speculation really started to pick up. Fans began connecting dots. Analysts started asking subtle questions. Not outright accusations, but enough to signal that something deeper might be unfolding behind the scenes. Was this a performance issue? Was it a coaching decision? Or was this tied to something bigger, something personal? Because timing matters. And Gabriel's disappearance didn't happen in isolation. It came after a stretch of moments that, when looked at individually, didn't seem huge, but together started forming a pattern. A pattern that suggested this wasn't just about football anymore. What made it even more strange was how quickly the narrative around him changed. Just months earlier, he was being discussed as a potential piece of the future. A player who could develop, contribute, maybe even surprise people. Now, he wasn't even part of the conversation. It was like the team had already moved on, without saying it out loud. And that kind of shift doesn't happen overnight unless something forces it. Because teams don't just give up on talent that fast, especially not at quarterback. So the questions started getting louder. What did Dillon Gabriel do, or what happened around him, that made the organization pull back this hard? And more importantly, who benefited from his sudden disappearance? Because while one name was quietly fading out of the picture, another was becoming impossible to ignore. And that's where the story takes a turn no one can overlook. Dillon Gabriel didn't walk into Cleveland as an unknown. When he joined the Cleveland Browns, there was real momentum behind him. Analysts talked about upside. Fans were curious. And inside the building, there was at least an expectation that he could grow into something valuable. But it didn't take long for the tone to shift. Not because of one big moment, but because of a series of small ones that started adding up. Early on, there were subtle signs that Gabriel wasn't fully syncing with the locker room. Nothing explosive, nothing headline-worthy. Just little things, body language, interviews, comments that felt slightly off. And then came the quote that really got people talking. During a media interaction, Gabriel made a distinction between entertainers and competitors. On its own, it sounded like a standard athlete mindset, focusing on winning over hype. But the way it came across and the timing of it didn't sit right with everyone. Because fans quickly began speculating, who exactly was that directed at? No names were mentioned. No direct shots were confirmed. But in a locker room where personalities matter and leadership is constantly being evaluated, even vague comments can carry weight. And that's where things started to feel tense. Reports didn't come out saying there was a full-blown issue, but you didn't need confirmation to sense the shift. The energy around Gabriel felt different. Less excitement, more questions. Meanwhile, another presence in that same locker room was starting to grow stronger by the day. ShedeurSanders wasn't just another young quarterback trying to find his footing. From early on, he carried himself like someone who expected to lead. Focused, vocal, and extremely aware of the standard he wanted to set. And that kind of presence naturally changes the dynamic. Because when one player is pushing for control and another is still trying to establish himself, friction becomes almost unavoidable. Again, nothing was officially labeled as conflict. But fans noticed moments. Analysts pointed out contrasts. One player was being praised for composure and leadership. The other was being questioned for tone and fit. And slowly, the gap between perception and reality started to widen. It became less about competition and more about alignment. Was Gabriel on the same page as the rest of the team? Did he understand the culture that was being built? Or was he operating on a completely different wavelength? Because in the NFL, talent alone doesn't guarantee anything, especially at quarterback. Leadership, communication, and respect inside the locker room matter just as much, sometimes even more. And when those elements feel off, even slightly, it doesn't stay quiet for long. What made the situation even more interesting was how quickly the narrative began to tilt. Not in a dramatic, headline-grabbing way, but in a steady, noticeable shift. The confidence around Gabriel started fading. The belief in someone else started rising. And while it still hadn't exploded into a public situation, you could feel something building beneath the surface. Because moments like these, they don't just disappear. They lead somewhere. And in this case, where it was heading next would turn quiet tension into something much harder to ignore. While the questions around Dylan Gabriel were starting to grow, something else was happening at the exact same time. A completely different narrative was taking over the locker room, and it revolved around ShedeurSanders. Because this wasn't just a young quarterback showing flashes. This was a player who, week by week, started making it very clear that he wasn't waiting his turn, he was taking it. From early practices to game situations, reports and fan discussions kept pointing to the same thing: Shedeur looked different. Not just in skill, but in presence. Calm under pressure, confident in his reads, and most importantly, in control. And that's where the contrast with Gabriel started to feel impossible to ignore. On one side, you had a player still trying to establish himself, with questions forming about his fit and attitude. On the other, you had someone who looked like he already understood the system, the expectations, and the responsibility that came with leading a team like the Cleveland Browns. It wasn't just about performance. It was about command. Fans began noticing how teammates responded, body language on the sidelines, energy during big moments. Again, nothing officially confirmed as tension, but enough for speculation to grow. Because leadership in football isn't always announced, it's recognized. And more, it seemed like players were naturally gravitating toward Shedeur. That's when the conversation shifted from competition to something more layered. Because now, it wasn't just about who played better. It was about who the team believed in. There's been a lot of buzz online about this period, with some fans speculating that the gap between the two quarterbacks became more than just a performance issue. Reports and discussions suggested that Shedeur's rapid rise may have unintentionally put pressure on Gabriel, not through direct conflict, but through comparison. Every strong performance from Shedeur made the spotlight brighter. Every question about Gabriel made it harder to ignore. And in situations like that, even small moments start to carry more weight. A comment here, a reaction there, a missed opportunity on the field. It all starts building into a larger narrative, whether it's fully accurate or not. Meanwhile, Shedeur kept doing the one thing that silences doubt: producing. Clutch throws, smart decisions, composure in high-pressure situations. The kind of plays that don't just win games, but earn trust inside a locker room. And that trust, it changes everything. If you love real talk and fearless NFL breakdowns, hit subscribe and join Coach Speaks. Because once a team starts believing in one leader, it becomes harder for anyone else to claim that same space. That doesn't mean there was a direct clash. There's no confirmed moment where everything boiled over, but the perception of a divide that was growing stronger by the week. And perception, especially in the NFL, can shape reality faster than anything else. By this point, the storyline had clearly shifted. This was no longer about two quarterbacks developing side by side. It had become a takeover. One player rising fast, gaining control, and setting the tone, while the other was slowly being pushed to the edge of the picture. And just when it seemed like things might settle on the field, the situation took a turn that had nothing to do with football at all. Because what happened next didn't stay in the locker room. It spilled out into the public and made everything impossible to ignore. Just when it seemed like the situation might stay contained to the field and inside the locker room, it didn't. It spilled out into the public. And that's when everything escalated. Because suddenly, this wasn't just about performance, reps, or depth charts anymore. It became about perception, reputation, and how things were being handled off the field. The turning point came when online chatter started picking up around Dylan Gabriel's inner circle, specifically involving his fiancée. Posts began circulating across social media, and while nothing was officially confirmed by the team, fans quickly started connecting the dots. Some of those posts appeared to take indirect shots at ShedeurSanders, questioning credibility, throwing subtle jabs, and adding fuel to a situation that was already under pressure. Now, to be clear, a lot of this falls into the category of speculation. There's been a lot of buzz online, with users interpreting screenshots, reposts, and comments in different ways. Some believe the messages were intentional. Others think it may have been blown out of proportion. But in situations like this, perception often moves faster than truth. And the perception was that things had gone too far. Because in a professional environment, especially inside an organization like the Cleveland Browns, anything that even looks like internal conflict going public is a problem. Teams value control. They value unity. And more than anything, they value players who can manage pressure without letting it turn into distraction. So when this situation started gaining traction online, it didn't just reflect on one person. It reflected on Gabriel as well. Fair or not? Because one question immediately started circulating among fans and analysts. Why didn't he step in? There were no strong public statements shutting things down, no clear attempt to calm the narrative, at least none that gained traction in the media cycle. And that silence, it became part of the story. Some interpreted it as him staying out of drama. Others saw it as a lack of leadership, especially in a moment where tensions were already being discussed. Either way, it added another layer to the situation. Now it wasn't just about what was happening between players. It was about how those situations were being handled when the spotlight hit. And that matters more than people think. Because teams aren't just evaluating talent, they're evaluating stability, how players respond under pressure, how they handle noise, how they protect the locker room when things get messy. And right now, everything about this situation was starting to look messy. Meanwhile, on the other side, Shedeur's image continued to move in the opposite direction. Focused, controlled, locked in on performance. Whether that contrast is completely fair or not, it's the narrative that began to take hold. And narratives like that, they stick. By this point, what started as quiet tension had turned into a full-blown storyline. Not officially confirmed, not directly addressed, but impossible to ignore. Because once off-field drama enters the picture, it doesn't just stay in the background. It starts influencing decisions. And what happened next suggested that behind closed doors, those decisions were already being made. While the situation inside the building was getting more complicated, the conversation outside of it was heading in a completely different direction. Because if you were only listening to certain media voices at the time, you'd think Dillon Gabriel was still firmly in control of the narrative. Analysts continued to highlight his potential. Discussions framed him as a system-fit quarterback who just needed time. Some reports suggested he had a stronger grasp of the offense, better field vision, or a higher long-term ceiling. And on paper, that sounded convincing. But then people started watching the games more closely. And that's where things didn't quite match up. Because while the media narrative kept pushing optimism around Gabriel, what fans were seeing on the field told a different story. Not terrible performances, but inconsistent ones. Moments of promise followed by stretches where things just didn't click. Timing felt off, reads looked delayed, and in high-pressure situations, the confidence didn't always translate. Meanwhile, every time ShedeurSanders stepped onto the field, the energy shifted. It wasn't just about stats, although those conversations were starting to lean in his favor too. It was about control, the way drives were managed, the ability to stay composed when things broke down, the sense that something could happen on any given play. And fans picked up on that quickly. There's been a lot of discussion online about this contrast, with some viewers pointing out how different the two quarterbacks looked in similar situations. Not as a definitive judgment, but as a growing observation. One looked like he was still adjusting. The other looked like he had already arrived. That's when the gap between media narrative And game reality started to feel impossible to ignore. Because week after week, the same pattern kept showing up. Gabriel would have flashes, a solid throw here, a decent drive there, enough to keep the conversation alive. Enough for analysts to say, see, it's there. But then the bigger moments would come. And that's where things shifted. Because those were the moments where Shedeur seemed to take over. Clutch situations, tight games, drives that needed precision and calm decision-making. And more often than not, he delivered in ways that felt decisive. Not lucky, not forced. Controlled. And that difference started shaping perception fast. Even the analysts who had strongly backed Gabriel began adjusting their tone, not completely abandoning the original take, but softening it, adding conditions, shifting expectations. It's about the system. He needs more time. Maybe a different role fits better. All subtle changes, but important ones. Because when the narrative starts changing, it usually means reality has already shifted. And by this point, fans weren't just debating who could be the better quarterback. They were starting to feel like the answer was already clear. Still, none of this had been officially addressed by the team. No public statements, no dramatic announcements. Just a quiet shift in momentum. But behind the scenes, that silence was about to break. Because while the media was still catching up to what was happening, the people making decisions had already seen enough. And the next move would make it impossible for anyone to ignore what direction this team was really heading. Everything up to this point had been building quietly, tension in the locker room, questions from fans, mixed signals from the media. But nothing actually forced a decision. Until the coaching situation changed. Because once leadership at the top shifts, everything underneath it gets reevaluated. Every player, every role, every storyline. And that's exactly what happened when Kevin Stefanski was no longer part of the picture. Suddenly, the system that Dillon Gabriel entered, the one that may have given him time, flexibility, or even protection in the depth chart, was gone. And in came a completely new voice. Todd Monken. Now here, where things took a sharp turn. Because new coaches don't carry old attachments. They don't draft players. They don't build initial narratives. They evaluate what's in front of them and make decisions based on what they see, not what was expected months ago. And according to reports and observations from early team activity, Monken didn't take long to form his opinion. From the very beginning, there was a noticeable shift in how things were being handled. Rotations looked different. Opportunities were distributed differently. And most importantly, certain names started getting more attention than others. And one name that wasn't coming up much anymore. Dillon Gabriel. No strong endorsements, no public backing, no clear signs that he was part of the long-term plan. Now again, nothing was directly stated. But sometimes, what isn't said tells you everything. Because while Gabriel's presence seemed to fade even further, ShedeurSanders was moving in the opposite direction. More reps, more responsibility, more visible trust from the coaching staff. In that contrast, it didn't go unnoticed. If you love real talk and fearless NFL breakdowns, hit subscribe and join Coach Speaks. There's been growing speculation that Monken quickly identified who he believed could lead the team moving forward, not just from a talent standpoint, but from a leadership and culture perspective as well. And if that's true, then this wasn't a slow decision. It was immediate. Because coaches at that level don't wait around when they see a mismatch between a player and the system they want to build. They act. And everything about this situation suggests that a decision was made, just not announced in the traditional way. No dramatic benching. No headline release. Just a gradual shift that became impossible to ignore. Less involvement, less visibility, less relevance. Until one player was essentially out of the picture, and another was clearly being positioned as the future. What makes this even more telling is how clean the transition looked from the outside. No chaos, no confusion, just a quiet but firm redirection of the team's focus. And that usually only happens when leadership is completely certain. Because once a coach locks in on his guy, everyone else falls in line. Or they fall out. And by this point, it was becoming very clear which direction Dylan Gabriel was heading. Because, while the public was still debating what might happen, behind closed doors, the decision may have already been finalized. And the next move would confirm everything people had been suspecting all along. By the time everything reached this point, the outcome almost felt inevitable. Not because the team had made a loud announcement, but because every sign leading up to it pointed in the same direction. Dylan Gabriel was on his way out. Now, to be clear, there hasn't been a dramatic, official statement spelling everything out step by step. But there's been a growing wave of reports, discussions, and insider speculation suggesting that the Cleveland Browns are ready to move on. And not in a gradual, long-term development way, but in a decisive, immediate shift. What's really catching attention is how fast his perceived value has changed. Not long ago, Gabriel was viewed as a solid investment, a top 100 pick with upside, someone worth developing. Now, there's talk that he could be moved for a late-round return, possibly as low as a day 3 pick. That kind of drop doesn't happen without a reason. Teams don't just give up on quarterback talent that quickly unless they've already reached a conclusion internally. And based on everything we've seen, the lack of reps, the silence from coaches, the off-field noise, and the shift in locker room dynamics, it paints a picture of a decision that's already been made behind closed doors. This isn't just about performance anymore. It's about fit. Because in today's NFL, especially at quarterback, organizations are looking for more than just arm strength or raw ability. They're looking for players who align with the culture, who can handle pressure, who can lead without creating distraction. And right now, all signs suggest that the Browns believe they've found that in ShedeurSanders. That's what makes this situation bigger than just one player being moved. It's a message about what this team values moving forward. Because when a franchise makes a shift like this, especially at the quarterback position, it tells you exactly what direction they're heading in. It tells you who they trust, who they're willing to build around, and just as importantly, who they're not. There's also a broader lesson here that fans and analysts are starting to talk about. Potential only carries you so far. At some point, it has to translate, not just on the field, but in how you carry yourself, how you respond to adversity, and how you fit within a team environment that's constantly under pressure. And if there's even a hint that those pieces aren't aligning, teams won't hesitate to move on, even quickly. For Gabriel, this moment could be a reset, a chance to land in a different system, away from the noise, where expectations are different and the spotlight isn't as intense. But in Cleveland, the chapter looks like it's closing. And for the Browns, the focus is no longer divided. Because with one player seemingly on the way out, all the attention is now locked in on the one who stayed. And what that means for the future. That's where this story gets even bigger. When you step back and look at everything that's unfolded, this story stops being just about one player's rise and another's exit. It becomes about a shift in identity, in expectations, and in how the Cleveland Browns want to move forward. Because situations like this don't happen in isolation. They reveal what a franchise truly values when things get complicated. Not when everything is going right, but when there's tension, noise, and tough decisions to make behind closed doors. And in this case, the message feels clear. Talent matters, but alignment matters more. From the outside, Dylan Gabriel's situation might look sudden. A promising player, a quick fall-off, and now a likely exit. But when you connect all the pieces, the absence from preparation, the questions around locker room fit, the off-field distractions, and the shift in coaching philosophy, it starts to feel less like a surprise and more like a decision that had been building over time. At the same time, another path was being created, one centered around ShedeurSanders. Not just because of performance, although that clearly played a role, but because of what he represents: composure under pressure, confidence without hesitation, a presence that, whether fairly or not, has come to symbolize stability in a situation that could have easily gone the other way. There's been a lot of conversation online about this transition, with fans and analysts debating how much of it was performance-based and how much was influenced by everything happening off the field. And the truth is, it's probably a mix of both. But that's what makes this moment so important, because it highlights how quickly things can change in the NFL. 1 minute, you're part of the future. The next, you're being replaced by it. And it's not always about one big mistake. Sometimes it's about a series of small moments, comments, reactions, decisions that slowly shift how an organization sees you. On the flip side, it shows how quickly a player can take control of a situation when everything starts clicking at once. Opportunity, performance, timing, and the ability to handle the spotlight when it gets intense. Right now, all of those things seem to be aligning for Shedeur. And if that continues, this won't just be remembered as a quarterback chain. It'll be remembered as the moment the Browns fully committed to a new era. Of course, there are still questions. How will this decision play out over a full season? Can the momentum carry forward? And what happens if expectations rise even higher? Those answers are still ahead. But one thing already feels certain. The direction has been chosen. The focus is locked in. And the margin for distraction has disappeared. Because in a league where every move is evaluated and every narrative is amplified, teams don't just move forward by accident. They choose who to build around. They choose who to trust. And sometimes, they make that choice by letting someone else go.
If you enjoyed today's breakdown and want to keep up with all the drama, trades, and behind-the-scenes action in the NFL, then don't forget to hit that like button. It really helps this channel grow and lets us know you love this kind of content. And hey, don't keep it to yourself. Share this video with your friends, your group chats, or anyone who loves football as much as you do. The more the conversation spreads, the better it gets. Most importantly, if you haven't already, make sure you subscribe to the channel and tap the notification bell. That way, you'll never miss when we drop fresh stories, wild rumors, or breaking updates that the mainstream media won't talk about.